Hey y'all, and welcome back to my channel. In this tutorial we are going to create this peekaboo honeybee floral and epoxy drip tumbler. We're going to start out with a 24-ounce plump from the Still Magnolia, and we are going to use the epoxy method to apply our glitter. The epoxy method is you use 1 to 2 milliliters, just enough epoxy to get a very micro thin layer of epoxy on your tumbler. Once our epoxy is all over the tumbler, I'm going to take my hand and dab it all around the tumbler so I can texturize that epoxy and eliminate any streaks I may have. We are using Chanel from PDB Creative Studio, and normally I would not cover the bottom of my tumbler if I plan on doing a peekaboo. I was just in the zone and coated the bottom of this one. So for reference, if you do a peekaboo and you don't plan on taking your design over the bottom of your tumbler, don't even worry about adding epoxy to it. That way it minimizes the amount of sanding that you have to do on the bottom of your tumbler, and it helps you get a smoother surface. Chanel is one of the most beautiful gold glitters I have in my entire glitter collection. I use it quite often, and I really hate that so much of it was covered up on this tumbler. There are a couple of things that I would have done a little bit differently so that we can see more of it in the end. You'll see what I'm talking about once we get to the stencil, but just admire it right now because most of it is going to be covered up later on in the tutorial. After you have all your glitter on there, roll it in a piece of parchment paper to flatten out that glitter. And we applied 2 coats of epoxy to this tumbler to get it really nice and smooth for our stencil. So to create our honeycomb, I'm going to take one of the honeycomb shapes from Design Space, and then I'm going to create a 0.045 offset. And then I'm going to highlight both the original shape and the offset and select slice, and it's going to give me a nice outline. Right here is where I wish that I would have made the offset a little bit bigger. These lines are super thin, so if you create your honeycomb this way instead of using a file, definitely make that offset a little bit larger so that you can see more of your glitter peeking through. I think this tumbler turned out wonderful in the end. I really like the result, and even the fact that the honeycomb is very light in the background, because it did help the flowers and the honeybees and the drip stand out even more. But had I known that these were going to turn out so thin, I definitely would have used maybe some shape tape, the double-sided adhesive from Artistry Epoxy, cut out my honeycombs and just applied the glitter directly to that over top of my spray paint, so I didn't waste or cover up as much of our beautiful Chanel. So I created our little shape by connecting all of them together, just overlapping that offset line, and then I highlighted them all and selected weld so that they would cut all as one image, and then I just duplicated it and rotated it in different directions and attached them all together. And I did so over top of the rectangle shape in the exact dimensions of my tumbler so that I know that this will wrap around my tumbler perfectly. After I had my honeycomb pattern laid out, I highlighted the 2 on the left side that was hanging over the edge, took them over to the right side to make sure that it was going to line up perfectly and we're going to have the correct distance between our honeycombs at the seam. After I verified everything was lined up correctly and we had the correct sizing, I removed that additional honeycomb pattern and the background, highlighted everything I had attached together, and welded it. Anytime that I use a chunky glitter or any glitter at all really, I seal before I apply my epoxy. I feel like it just prevents my glitter moving around while I'm applying that first layer, eliminates some additional micro bubbles that it can cause, and it also prevents repelling when you use a chunky glitter. Well, I forgot to seal this one, so we had some issues with our first epoxy layer and I had to sand like crazy. So on that second layer, we still didn't get everything nice and even. So that is why my tumbler looks heavily sanded, and there are still a few imperfections down towards the bottom of the tumbler. But I did leave those. I typically wouldn't, simply because we are going to add on the florals at the bottom of the tumbler and they'll all be covered up. I have weeded out my stencil that I cut on temporary or removable vinyl. I'm going to place my transfer tape over top of it and then trim out very close to this one so that I can get it perfectly lined up with the top rim of my tumbler so that our honeycomb pattern is not crooked all the way around. I trimmed off a little bit of the backing from the transfer tape, so once I had it lined up on my tumbler really nice and straight, I can press that exposed piece down. It will keep it in place and I can work my way around the tumbler, pressing down my stencil as I am removing the back. After I had my stencil on, it was time to give this a coat of spray paint. I was going for more of a realistic look on this one, so I wanted to do the extra guac from Color Shot on the bottom to mimic like a grass, and then we went with slate blue from Rust-Oleum for the sky. Before we remove our stencils, we're going to go in with some additional glitter. So I'm taking my full adhesive glue from Southern Belle Glitter. I'm going to do a very thin coat of this. Literally, this was too much to coat the entire tumbler, and it was one little dab on the top of my brush. So you'll see me wipe off some of this in the end. A little bit of this glue goes a long way, and it is super tacky. When you are applying your full glue, if you're using it specifically for fulls, or if you are doing a glitter application like I am, you want to make sure you have a really nice smooth coat, and you want to take your brush strokes all in the same direction. So I go up and down my tumbler, and then on the bottom I usually just dab my brush so that it almost texturizes it, but you cannot tell underneath your glitter or your fulls, because I don't want to see those brush strokes through any media that I put on top of it. Once I have covered my entire tumbler and wiped off that excess, then I went in with my heat gun on low heat setting and dried this very quickly before adding on our glitter. Before we add on our fine cut glitter, I'm going to use this random cut Firefly and sprinkle that all over the tumbler just to give it a little additional dimension. I will pat that down and then go in with Firefly 0.08 cut, also from PDB Creative Studio. Once this glitter is on, I'm going to rub it down into that full adhesive and get all that excess glitter off, and then we're going to seal it twice with a matte clear spray paint. Once our sealer has dried, then we can remove our stencils. Once our stencils are removed, then we can go in with a nice coat of epoxy so that this is glossy to add on our decals. This is one of my collab sheets with Gracefully Created. You can find all of the florals and patterns that we have collaborated on in the Brittany Barnes creator section on the gracefullycreatedccd.com website. I cut out the longest piece on the sheet, trimmed off a little bit of that backing so that I could press it down once I have it lined up on my tumbler. Instead of cutting a straight line down my seam, I got a little bit creative and trimmed out around my flower that was overlapping so that it appeared as if it was a seamless decal. Now that we have our decals on, it's time to add on our drip. Don't forget to put on your respirator before you mix your epoxy, and especially before you use any sort of epoxy thickener. We are using the ARTISTRY 1:1 ratio facet epoxy, so we could have allowed this to set up just a bit, but it would take a little bit longer than using the thickener. So we're using Nice and Thick from CC DIY. And before I add in that, I am going to add in my micas to give it a little bit of a honey color. I'm using the yellow micro mini from Artistry Epoxy or COLORFLEX, and then I'm adding in a teeny tiny little bit of oak from PDB Creative Studio. I didn't have the perfect honey color on hand, so I just created it by combining those two micas. Once we have this mixed up really nice, I'm going to add in our Nice and Thick very slowly to get this to a thickness that I want to apply to our tumbler. Now, this stuff can clump inside of your epoxy, so you want to try to almost take all of those little clumps of the powder that you add in and pull them to the side and press them out rather than stirring. To me, this helps eliminate getting some micro bubbles from constantly like whipping it to get it to mix in all together. So I just pull it to the side and press out any of those little bubbles of powder that we get in our epoxy mixture. You can see I have a larger mixing cup up to the left, and that is so that I can test my drips between each time that I add in my thickener. You want your epoxy to be thick enough to where it sort of hangs out where you put it and very, very slowly drips down, but you don't want it set up to enough to where it's not going to move at all or become very difficult to spread out around the top of your tumbler. As you can see, those first two test strips, or the first three, have really went down the side of this cup, and this one right here was the perfect one. You see how it's kind of hanging down at the top, but you can see that it wants to try to drip. That's when you want to apply it to your tumbler. You do want to move pretty quickly once you get to this point. Just get not too much on your popsicle stick, and as you are dragging the popsicle stick back around the rim of your tumbler, move around the tumbler as well, and that's going to leave just a little bit of epoxy around that top rim, and it will begin to drip. So you don't want one side of your tumbler to drip further than the other. So to keep it consistent and nice and even, just work pretty quickly, and if there are any areas that you want to be a little bit thicker or it's not dripping where you want it to, then you can go back in with additional epoxy and make that a little bit thicker. I got pretty lucky on this one and the drips just worked perfectly, but in a case where one just kind of goes rogue on you and wants to go down the side of your tumbler or somewhere you don't want it to go, make sure you have a set of baby wipes on hand, and that will help you either shape the bottom of your drip, or it can help you remove any excess without damaging your cup. You can also control the drips by constantly turning your tumbler the opposite way. Face it down towards your table and then face it back up to help keep them in the spots that they're in. And if they're not moving fast enough, you can take your heat gun on a low heat setting and very, very slowly apply some heat and allow them to drip. I'll be adding on a logo on the front of this, so we're going to avoid putting any of our little honeybees over top of that section, but we're just going to take them and place them in random spots in between our drips and our florals. And after I added on my decal, it was time for our final coats of epoxy. When you are epoxying over a drip, you want to do your tumbler first and then go over your drip with a very thin coat of epoxy. You do want to seal them in, but you do have to be careful on the amount of epoxy that you put around your drips, because you do not want it to pull around the sides or the bottom or around any of the creases, because it can make it difficult to remove any micro bubbles that might be in those pools of epoxy and cause some discoloration or fogginess around your drips. After our two final coats of epoxy, this beauty was complete. I love how it turned out, even despite our peekaboo not being so strong on this one. I like that it's just a hint of the honeycomb peekaboo in the background, and those florals, the drips, and the honeybees really stand out. As always, all materials that I have used in this tutorial will be linked down below in the description with some coupon codes for y'all. If you have any questions, just drop them in the comments and I'll answer them as quickly as possible. I hope that y'all have enjoyed this tutorial. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit the bell in the corner to be notified anytime a new tutorial drops. That is all for today. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next time.